Hello, I'm Tim Loughton MP for East Worthing and Shoreham, and welcome to the latest of my 2-minute podcasts. Now I want to talk about Europe again. That's going to be the subject in all headlines until the referendum on June the 23rd. And I've had a lot of angry constituents contact me in the last week or so, having received this through their letterboxes. This is a government propaganda sheet costing £9.3 million to you, me, or the taxpayers, telling you why you should vote to stay in the EU on June the 23rd. And then this week we've had the Treasury produce at great cost, great use of resources, this 200-page document full of Treasury analysis, including lots of very complicated algebraic formulae, saying again why it will be a disaster, there will be a plague of frogs, the Martians would invade if we vote to come out of the EU on June the 23rd. Well, I think they're wrong. I'm supporting the Vote Leave campaign, as you know, and I think this is a misuse of public funds, and it is purely government propaganda and government opinion dressed up as facts, and it's not facts. Now, when we were discussing the European referendum bill, which brings about the referendum on the 23rd of June, there are very clear safeguards in that piece of legislation called PERDA, so that the government could not use the machinery of government, the civil service and others, to support one side or the other in the run-up to the referendum itself. We were assured that the government would not be splashing taxpayers' cash on literature, on posters and so on, to support one side of the argument, their side of the argument, to stay in the EU. But that's exactly what they've done. I think it's a misuse of public funds. I think it's unfair. It's not a level playing field. And worst of all, it is propaganda dressed up as facts. Now, I'm sure you've gone through this booklet as closely as I have, and I know many of you have subsequently posted it back to number 10 and put it in a letterbox. But let's just look at some of the things it says here. That voting to leave the EU would create years of uncertainty and potential economic disruption. This would reduce investment and cost jobs, and the government judges it could result in 10 years or more of uncertainty as the UK unpicks our relationship with the EU. That's an opinion. It's not facts. Now, we know that if we vote to come out of the EU on June the 23rd, that there is going to be a period of uncertainty, as with any ending of a relationship. But actually in the treaties that give rise to our membership of the EU, there is a 2-year period set out during which we renegotiate our relationship with the 27 EU nations, with Britain outside it. We think we can use that negotiation to get a much better deal for the United Kingdom, looking to trade with the rest of the world, freed from all the EU regulations, for our businesses to be able to promote British interests for our British employees. Now, this document that the Treasury has come up with claims that by 2030 there will be a cost of leaving the EU of £4,300 to each and every household. Well, trying to forecast what's going to happen 14 years out is impossible. The Treasury struggles to forecast what's going to happen 14 weeks or 14 months out at times. So this is entirely speculation. But it's actually speculation which only looks at part of the whole equation. It ignores the fact that the EU is a shrinking trade bloc. I've said before that the EU's share of world GDP is just 60% of what it was back in 1990, and we are continuing to contract in the EU whilst the rest of the world moves ahead. It doesn't take any notice of what the risks, the uncertainty of what would happen when the 18 Eurozone countries decide the legislation for the EU, which may not be in the interests of the non-Eurozone countries, of which the UK, thank goodness, is one. It doesn't take any notice of the increased uncertainty for new nations coming into the EU, new Eastern European nations who have much poorer economies than us, or the prospect of Turkey having membership or some form of membership in the future as well. It says nothing about taking account of the uncertainty of the immigration crisis. Now, 1.83 million people came into the EU last year, many from the Middle East. This document actually forecasts that there will be at least another 3 million people coming from the EU to the UK alone by 2030 at a time when the government is trying to reduce the amount of net immigration coming into this country. And we know, particularly in the southeast of England, all the pressures that brings on our schools, our hospitals, our infrastructure and our public services. So all that uncertainty doesn't feature in these bits of government propaganda. So they're dodgy numbers. These are dodgy forecasts. These are dodgy bits of propaganda to pursue the government's case, and I think that is wrong. It also takes absolutely no account of the new trade deals that we could negotiate with other countries outside of the EU that we can't negotiate at the moment because we have to go through the EU. A prime example is India. Now, the EU has tried for the last 9 years to negotiate a trade deal with India, and it's just collapsed. The tiny Principality of Liechtenstein has just negotiated a trade deal with India, which took about 6 months. Now, India is an important trading partner for us. It could be a much, much bigger trading partner for us outside of the EU. We can get out there, negotiate trade deals with India, with China, with Russia, with Brazil, Singapore, the growing economies of the world, which is where the action is. That would produce more wealth for the United Kingdom, more jobs for United Kingdom employees, and greater stability and prosperity for our families. But you won't find that anywhere in this document. And it's quite interesting when you look at the trade deals that the EU has negotiated with other countries. The aggregate GDP, the value of their economies that the EU has negotiated with those countries, amounts to $7.3 trillion, I think the figure is. The aggregate value of the GDP of the economies that Chile alone has negotiated trade deals with is $58 trillion, hugely more than the EU, with 500 million people, with 28 different nations, has been able to achieve over many, many years. So don't believe the scare stories. The opportunities for Britain to be free to trade with the rest of the world in our interests and trade with partners that we should have been trading with years ago if we hadn't been held back by the EU is enormous. And then this document doesn't take any account of the reduced costs of having no longer to comply with EU regulations on business. We have something like 3,000 EU regulations every year which impose extra burdens on our business. Some of them are very useful. I think many of them we will want to continue to sign up to, but many of them don't, and just produce extra paperwork, extra bureaucracy, extra costs to our businesses passed on to the consumer. And it's been calculated that the 100 most burdensome business regulations coming from Europe cost British businesses something like £33.3 billion alone. So we didn't have to comply with most of that. Just think of how much better off our businesses, people working for them, and therefore our families could be. So this figure of £4,300 is complete nonsense. It's propaganda and should be absolutely treated with the contempt it deserves. So I think we've had a lot of complaints in this referendum campaign so far that it's been too much based on negative scare stories and project fear. And I'm afraid these two pretty pitiful documents just confirm that even more. I hope in the remaining 63 days of this referendum campaign we can get back to the business of looking at the facts. And I will be helping the Vote Leave campaign to produce some papers and podcasts over coming weeks to show what leaving the EU will mean for you, for your family, for your job, for your relations living in other parts of Europe and abroad, to show that actually Britain has a really bright future if we make a fresh start, freed from the burden and the constraints of the European Union, freed up as we always have done in the past to trade, to deal with the rest of the world beyond the constraints of the EU. I'm all for European unity, but I'm convinced that no longer is going to be achieved through European Union. So let's vote Leave on the 23rd of June for a fresh start, a brighter future for the United Kingdom in the rest of the world, where 6.9 billion people actually live.